we're trying to correct the system and not destroy it. Now, this particular court case was filed into the United States District Court toward the end of last November, and the defendants very shortly thereafter came back with an offer to settle.
Today we have on Winston Shrout and Keith Scott. Now, this is relating back to a previous episode where we discussed the trillion-dollar lawsuit to end financial tyranny, as many people are referring to it, with Brandon Turbeville of activistpost.com. And this relates to a wide variety of things, but actually our guests today are kind of insiders on this story, so they have a lot more information to share on this front, and a lot of information which we will not be able to get anywhere else. And I'm very excited for this because they're going to be laying all this information out in a way that even someone like myself, who's not an economist or a financial guru by any means, and I'm sure many of our listeners are in a similar position where we can actually understand what's going on in this case and what it means, what the impact could be for all of us. But a little intro. Winston Shrout is an educator who specializes in commercial remedies and legal processes. He's been doing seminars all around the world, sharing his unique understanding of commerce and law. He is now an advisor to Neil Keenan on commercial matters. And like I mentioned, Neil Keenan is the individual who actually filed this lawsuit, which was actually detailed by Courthouse News and several other news outlets. Keith Scott was the chief of cabinet for the Office of International Treasury Control for 14 years and has an extensive understanding of the global accounts and the use of these accounts, which the general public knows nothing of. Keith has taught Neil Keenan much about these accounts, and this is why the case has taken the direction it has. And Keith and Winston will explain why the Keenan case is so explosive, and the judge assigned to the case retired, much to the astonishment of his staff, and a judge whose brother is an economic advisor to President Barack Obama has been appointed to try the case. And welcome.
Great to be here.
And good morning to everybody. It's good evening over in the US. I'm in Asia at the moment.
Well, thanks for coming on. It seems like we're having some static come through on Winston's connection. I'm not sure what that is. But Keith, Winston, if you would just give us an intro in these few minutes before we go to the first break. What is this case, and why is it so important?
Okay, this case, Madison, started off by just a common theft. $134 billion in bonds were stolen from Neil Keenan by a fellow by the name of Daniel Del Bosco. And Del Bosco may well have been induced to do this by David Sale, who is from the Office of International Treasury Control. Now, just to make things fairly clear here, I worked for Office of International Treasury Control for some 14 years. And I left there in 2008. At the time this occurred, I was back in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, which is where the Office of International Treasury Control actually is run from, by a man by the name of Dr. Ray C. Dam. Now, in this particular case, $134 billion were stolen. They were in the form of Federal Reserve notes or bonds. These bonds are genuine. The Federal Reserve may try to claim otherwise, because when you look at the bonds themselves, they are written in such a way that they are deniable if you took them into a court. Now, the reason why this is, if somebody were to illegally possess these or try to use them, the government could then charge them with counterfeiting or fraud or whatever. And this avoids the government having to explain, not only the government, but the Federal Reserve having to explain exactly what these bonds are. Now, I will tell you this. There are the amount of these bonds that are in existence run into the many thousands of trillions of dollars. There is an enormous quantity out there. Now, let's try to keep with the actual case. So these bonds were stolen from Neil Keenan. Neil, when this first happened, nobody took a great deal of notice. He was kind of struggling. He then was introduced to myself. I explained to him that the bonds were genuine and that the actual owners of these bonds were the Dragon family, whom he represented, and that the Office of International Treasury Control, who claimed that they owned the bonds through David Sale, that they did not own the bonds. The bonds belonged to the Dragon family and therefore had been stolen from him. With that in case, I soon realized the value of this case, because what I could provide for Neil was the background, the history, and eventually I could even provide the codes that would allow us to prove in the banking screens that these bonds are genuine, that they are real. And that changed the complexion of the entire case. The reason why is because we would be able to prove that these bonds were genuine, that they were of value, and this would have exposed the entire system, the entire global system. But not only that, it would have exposed all the people who have been stealing and cheating and misusing these accounts for the last 50 years, because there is a record of that in the screens. And it probably would have meant something like about 300,000 bankers, politicians, and other people would have been heading to jail. So that's the leverage that this case actually provides. If those screens are opened and there is a judicial review and a proper audit done on these accounts, that will then expose the entire corrupt system that we know as the Federal Reserve.
Wow, that's fascinating. And we're coming up on the first break here in a moment, but I just want to, when we come back, I'd like to list some of the things that we're going to go over in the next hour or so, hour and a half or so. You know, I also want to connect this with one story that I covered, which I thought was fascinating, which was $6 trillion in allegedly fake bonds discovered in Italy in a Federal Reserve mother box. And Winston said, or Keith, I'm sorry, said that this does actually connect with what we're seeing here in this case. So you're listening to End the Lie Radio with Winston Shrout and Keith Scott. We will be coming back in a moment with much more information. Stick with us. And welcome back to End the Lie Radio. I'm your host, Madison Rupert, on with my guest today, Keith Scott and Winston Shrout, discussing the Neil Keenan case, which is a $1 trillion lawsuit. That is a massive number, very, very, very hard to actually visualize that amount of money. But people have been calling this the lawsuit to end financial tyranny, and this has gotten a huge amount of attention in the alternative media. But today our guests are actually involved with this effort, and they're going to give us a lot of information which we will not be able to find anywhere else. I'm very grateful to have them on. on, and I'm going to try as much as possible to take a back seat today and let them just explain what this case is and what their work actually means and break this down for us. But before we delve into many of the details, or maybe we should actually give some more details before you can properly relate this incident, but if you could you tell us a little bit how this the $6 trillion in allegedly fake bonds found in the Treaty of Versailles Federal Reserve mother box in Italy plays into this?
Okay. The first thing to understand is that usually when these bonds are found, the first thing you need to understand is that they are real, they're genuine. These bonds were issued against gold, which was centralized into the Federal Reserve between the years of 1928 right up until 1972. At that time, through those years, in actual fact, between the years of 1934 and 1972, all bullion gold and coin gold became the property of the state. It was illegal for people, private people, to own bullion gold or coin gold. You could have some gold jewelry, but generally that was at very, very rarely would you find that to be 24 carat. It would have been 12 carat, 14 carat, 18, up to about 20. When you come to bullion gold, this was all gathered from around the world, and it was put into the Bank of International Settlements. That's what the Bank of International Settlements was set up to handle, was the gold accounts. The gold from all around the world was gathered up by the nations of the world, so that we're now talking about taking something which was once privately owned and having been nationalised. Once it was nationalised, it was then combined into these global accounts under the Bank of International Settlements and Federal Reserve. These global accounts still underpin the currencies of the world today. Now, the Federal Reserve bonds were given back to the countries that handed their gold into the central system. These Federal Reserve notes that are being found currently in Italy and in other countries as well. Some I see in Ukraine, others in Croatia, others here within the Philippines and throughout Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia. These bonds are the actual bonds that were issued not only in 1934, there are 1934 series, but they may have been issued as late as in the 1973, 74, when the price of gold rose. And the reason this is that the gold that was leased to the Federal Reserve is a lease. And when you give something back to the government that handed that gold in, you have to give them back equitable value. Now, when we talk about equitable value, we're talking about leverage. Now, with gold, you can leverage that 20, 30, 40 times. And so when they issued these notes, they issued them at about 30 times the actual value of the gold that was handed in. And the amount of gold that was handed in was almost 2.5 million tonnes. It was not, as we're told, there's 120,000 tonnes. That may be what's in the markets of today and what people wear around in jewellery, etc. That may be 120,000 tonnes, but the actual amount of gold that's within the system is around 2.5 million tonnes. So this amount of gold, there were bonds issued against it, and those bonds would be at the leverage value, not just the standard value, but the leverage value, because to give back the central banks that handed this in, or the governments that handed this back in, you have to issue the notes at the full leverage value. And so probably somewhere around 30 times the actual value of the gold was issued in these Federal Reserve notes. Now, let me also explain one other thing here. These are not an obligation of the United States. They're not an obligation of the United States people. They are an obligation of the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is a private bank. It's owned privately. It has nothing to do with the United States. And in fact, the US dollar has nothing to do with the United States. It is not a United States dollar. It is a Federal Reserve note. And the debts and the obligations of the US dollar belong to the Federal Reserve, not to the people of the United States, any further than the United States, than the Federal Reserve control over the amount of gold that they own or hold. So these are not debts that belong to the people of the United States. They belong to a private banking institution. But they underpin the currencies of the world, not just the United States, not just the US dollar, but all currencies are actually backed, and we'll get to this a little bit further in the show, and Winston can then explain this to you in considerable detail. But now going back to the bonds. So these bonds really do exist, and they are genuine. But as I mentioned before, they are written in such a way, they have spelling mistakes. Well, they appear to be mistakes, but they're not really mistakes. They're codes. And these mistakes that are in the notes, when you present that to a judge will say, well, that can't possibly be right. This is a counterfeit, and bang, off you go to jail for the next 15 years. In the process, the truth never comes out. So the easiest thing to say is, these are counterfeit. When there's counterfeit, there's no questions to be answered. There's just a solution to the problem. Now, the owners of the gold receive these notes in payment for their gold as counter assets. The owners, in many cases, some of these notes have been stolen from the owners, and therefore the people who have them may well be that they acquired them illegally, but nobody has to justify this because we're talking about in a court about a counterfeit bond. It may be that it could be even the actual owner, and he can't prove that the bond is genuine, even when he's supposedly the owner or the holder. But there are...
I have to cut you off. I'm so sorry, Keith. I have to cut you off. We're coming into the break now. And welcome back to End the Lie Radio. I'm your host, Madison Rupert, and my website is endthelie.com. And if you missed it, you can jump in to the chat room with us to discuss this topic in real time by going to bit.ly.com/ETL Radio. And you can check past episodes as well as this one quite shortly at youtube.com/endthelie.
Okay. So on the situation on the $6 trillion in bonds that were found in Zurich, in actual fact, the people were rounded up by the Italian police. The bonds are probably real. I've never seen any, so I can't say emphatically that they are real, but the probability is that they are. The people who had them, I've seen nothing that evidences to me that they had any right to have them, that they had any right to control them. The second issue is that if you look at the history that was presented about the people, and it may be true, it may not be true, I don't want to judge that, but these people appeared to have a history of being loan sharks. They had, and they were also intending to buy plutonium out of Nigeria. Which sounds rather strange because as far as I know, there's no plutonium in Nigeria. But those are the issues that have been presented. And if so, then the system is working very nicely, because without exposing the financial system, they're able to put these people away in jail. Now, but are they doing it for the reasons that they say they're doing? No, they're not. And I think that's pretty clear. I think if somebody goes to jail, then we should know what the actual reason is, not what a contrived reason is. So on that issue. But another thing on these bonds, so let me keep going with this for a second, because there are some interesting things. Another interesting case was not just the $6 trillion, but an earlier case prior to the theft of the Keenan bonds, which was the Chiasso incident in Italy. And $134 billion in bonds were stolen from two Japanese gentlemen who were travelling across Italy. And those 130, they were arrested. The bonds were confiscated. They were said that they had been later tried and found guilty. There's no record of such a case being heard in Italy. There is no record anywhere within the Justice Administration of this case. But the bonds, mysteriously, a few months later, popped up again as TARP funds, unused TARP funds in the United States. So that tells you pretty much the story on the reality of these bonds. Now, going on to how they relate to this case. The case started off about these bonds. Neil Keenan needed to be able to prove that these bonds that he had were genuine. And when we were able to come up with the all the bank codes, the books, what's often referred to as the Book of Maclumat, which is actually the construction of the accounts and the account holders. These are special mandates appointed by President Sukarno when the gold was deposited into the global system in the 1960s. Having these codes threatens the entire system, because with these codes we can prove every lie that the Federal Reserve want to bring forward. We can prove it is a lie. With this, if this case goes to court, which is the way it seems to be going, this explains why the government have moved the first judge who was appointed, retired, and another judge has now been appointed, and that judge, his brother, is an economic advisor to the President of the United States. So that shows you the degree of concern there is over this case and the capacity of this case to literally destroy the existing system as we know it today. Now, having said that, that's not something anybody should be afraid of. We consider if we understand that the US dollar is funded by a global system, not just the United States taxpayer, but a global system, and that the US dollar that is actually owned by the principles of that global system. And I'm not talking about the Rothschilds, I'm talking about a trust that holds or owns the gold. They hold the copyright on the US dollar. Now, what that basically means that if we were to change the system, the impact on the US dollar would be negligible, probably in real terms and in terms of actual value, it would literally have no effect. Now, the US dollar is always supported by gold, always. And it doesn't matter whether markets go up, markets go down, doesn't matter what actually happens. The stability of the United States dollar is beyond that of any other currency. If you look at the European euro, for example, it's backed by a dream. And it doesn't have the same ties to these underwriting accounts that the US dollar does. So this case is absolutely a critical case because it has the capacity to for us to actually correct, I wouldn't say destroy the existing system, but to correct it. And people that have been misusing it and abusing it for years and using it to impose terrible debts and problems upon the American people, that will end. And that's really what we're seeking to do. It's not just now about the actual case itself. It's the more important issues that the case is, in actual fact, like a key opening a box. What's in the box? That's what everybody really wants to know, and that's where the problems for the existing cabal is. And once that's exposed, as I said, a lot of people are going to go to jail, and there will be a new system imposed because there will have to be, and it will bring banking back to where it needs to be, not where it is today. And I'll allow Winston to explain that as we get a little further along.
Well, great. Unfortunately, we just have about one more minute until we go into the next break, so I don't want to let Winston just jump right into that huge ocean of information yet. We'll do that when we come back and in the second hour as well. But this is very, very fascinating, and to me, someone who is an eternal optimist, even in times like these where so much is wrong and so much is ugly in the world, I try and see the good things, and something like this is extremely promising to me. It is very exciting that something like this could even occur, and the potential in this case is huge, in my opinion, and hopefully it will come to pass if all is as it should be. And welcome back to End the Lie Radio. I'm your host, Madison Rupert, and be sure to visit the website, endthelie.com. I want to just hand the torch back over to you guys, and Winston, if you want to get into it, or Keith, if you'd like to continue, please do in these last 10 minutes of the first hour.
Okay, what I'd like to do is just wrap up now with regard to these collateral accounts. The collateral accounts are absolutely enormous. They're so vast, it's almost they're beyond the comprehension of most people. And these accounts do actually underpin the world currencies. Now, when we talk about the Federal Reserve, I just mentioned that I believe needs to be eliminated. There's absolutely no reason to have a central bank. There's no purpose to it at all. There's nothing that a central bank does that a Ministry of Finance or a Treasury within a country can't do. And I think the sooner that thing we get rid of central banking, I think that's one of the first issues that we really need to deal with. Another issue that needs to be dealt with is to understand that the people who work in the Federal Reserve are not necessarily bad people. They might have bad bosses, but they're not necessarily all bad people. And I don't think they're as much to blame as what many people believe, because you have a thing called public policy. And to a certain degree, the Federal Reserve does not make public policy, but it's obliged to follow it. So it's a little bit of a two-edged sword here when we attack the Federal Reserve. It's fair on one way, but on the other way, for the people who actually work there, it may not be so fair. But the truth is, at the end of the day, they are the ones who implement these very, very bad rules. And they are the ones who carry the responsibility for what's actually happened in American banking, in fact, in global banking. And you can see this in America. The laws that have allowed banking to change from what it is today and what it once was these have been produced by other people, not just the Federal Reserve, but maybe you should look at your Congress with regard to this. Maybe you should look at your government, because they have allowed this to happen. And the shift has been absolutely astronomical. And when Winston gets going in a few minutes, I can guarantee you will understand that shift very, very well.
Well, actually, I've been sitting back and been fascinated with the information that Keith has put forward, and I'd actually rather listen to him. I've heard myself so many times, I kind of get tired of listening to myself. So, but anyway, some of the issues, I want to go back and re-emphasize that Keith had brought up, and I like the comment that we're trying to correct the system and not destroy it. Historically, what's happened in the United States over the years, and certainly going back into the 1930s and in the years that have come after that, is that the people in the country have not been educated and do not know how the system works and so forth. In consequence of that, most of the people simply have not had the opportunity to have these things explained. And as Keith was pointing out, even the people who work within the system, they have no idea what it is they're doing. And that is, they've simply taken a job, they've been given instructions about how to do their particular job, and that's about as far as it goes. And so Keith is right. There are good people in the system who simply do not know how it works and are following the instructions of those who hired them, and probably even they do not understand. And so we have this great dilemma that we're all dealing with, which surrounds itself more with ignorance than it does with intent to do evil. And, myself and others, certainly across the country, have been trying to educate and bring some of these things, to the people, so that we can start to understand. Because if you have no idea how the system works, then it would be just a stroke of luck if you actually operated correctly and properly within that system. We never encourage people to do things wrong. What we try to do is say, here's how the system was set up, here's the parameters, here's the rules and so forth, and utilize those things to solve your problems. Now, many of these problems relate to banking problems, to debt issues. A great number of them relate to court situations.
And welcome back to End the Lie Radio. I am your host, Madison Rupert, and my website is endthelie.com. And as always, you can chat with us in real time by going to bit.ly.com/ETL radio. And you can check out the archives there as well, or at youtube.com/endthelie. I want to just hand the torch right back over to them so they can continue with the information. Winston, if you'd like to continue, or Keith, if you'd like to jump in, it's all yours.
Okay, let me make a few more statements, and then maybe Keith might want to. It's been invaluable to me, certainly in my quest to have made the acquaintance of Keith. A lot of the things that I had studied, a lot of the conclusions that I had come to were based on inference and not upon information. And so about 2 or 3 years ago, I guess, Keith and I made an acquaintance, and he brought some things to me that certainly confirmed many things, and also opened up new ideas to expand on my knowledge. And so I always love to listen to Keith, because he's just a wealth of information, and I would suppose that he knows more about what he's talking about than anybody on the planet. Now, getting back to the situations, that we face here in the United States, And it has always been my position that if you want to know who is to blame for our problems, then you ought to look in the mirror. Because, again, for lack of education, for lack of information, or so forth, it is, in fact, the people. Now, it is true that our legal system, our system of doing things, has basically evolved into what we would refer to as an admiralty jurisdiction. But you have to understand, when we're talking about admiralty, we're talking about contracts, we're talking about all these things which are purely voluntary. And that is, we have the system as we have it. It affects you because you have volunteered to participate in that system in the way that you do. Now, we have spent a great deal of time educating people on how that system works, and certainly if you're going to be involved in that jurisdiction, if you're going to be involved in the way that system works, for crying out loud, do it right. And now you say, well, they're not doing it right. Well, that does not excuse you. And so if we have problems in the legal system, if we have problems in the financial world and so forth and so on, that does not excuse me. It does not excuse you from actually doing the thing right. And stop complaining about what everybody else is doing and start looking what it is that we're doing. Now, this for instance, this lawsuit, this RICO lawsuit, and I think people should maybe investigate what RICO is all about, but it has to do with racketeering, influence, corrupt organizations. And so that was why that particular type of lawsuit was entered into by Neil. And that was, he was saying, hey, we have organized crime. This is not the crime of an individual. This is not a breach of contract. This is not any of those things. But what we have here, we have a racketeering, influence, corrupt organization who is causing problems in this particular situation. Now, this particular court case was filed into the United States District Court. Now, this is not the District Court of the United States, for those of you who understand the difference. This was filed into the United States District Court, and it is in the admiralty jurisdiction. And so that's exactly how the thing has to be handled, and the attorney who wrote that whole thing up and filed it, that's exactly the premises and so forth that thing was filed under. Now, when you start talking about admiralty, it's all adversarial. And that means somebody wins and somebody's going to lose. Now, when you get involved in an adversarial situation, it only makes good sense not to reveal to your opponent your strategies. It's like a football game. You have the offensive team, you have the defensive team, you have the teams on one side and teams on the other side. And so at the end of when the whistle blows, somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. But in the meantime, one team does not reveal to the other his strategy. So it's the same thing when you get involved in these court systems, and that is you don't reveal to the other side what your strategy is. And so the thing was filed, and automatically, there was a panic from the adversary because, wow, we just got sued for $1 trillion. Oh, my goodness, what shall we do? Now, this was part of Neil's strategy. He wanted the other side to react because he based on their reaction, then he would determine what needed to be done next. For instance, what was it anticipated that this court case would actually go to trial? Well, he could, but not necessarily. I mean, part of the effort that was being made was simply to expose some of these things that had gone into the past, simply showing, what had occurred that had been to the detriment of the plaintiff. I was referring to a football game where the one team did not expose their strategy before they actually executed on it. And this is exactly what's happened with this civil RICO suit. Now, notice I said it's a civil RICO suit because, one has to understand that, first off, it's a very expensive thing to do. And what certainly should occur in the minds of the defendants in this matter right here is that once the civil RICO suit is proven, then it can be immediately rolled over into a criminal RICO. And so just as soon as that was filed, actually I think Neil filed that, or Neil's attorney there in New York filed that in the U.S. District Court toward the end of last November. And the defendants very shortly thereafter came back with an offer to settle. Now, at that time, again, Neil did not want to reveal his strategy, so he did not accept their offer for settlement at that time until certain other things were in place. Now, I can't tell you what Neil's total strategy is on this. He and Keith pretty much have that worked out, how that goes on, but I'm just, from my standpoint, where I see the possibilities of what could evolve from the civil RICO, then, we'll just have to wait and see how it works out. It's certainly this RICO suit is a part of a master plan. They just didn't put this together and throw it out there. There were certain things that wanted to be accomplished as results of the filing of that RICO suit. Now, some of you probably are aware, if you've looked at David Wilcock on his website, he had posted a preliminary of a what we refer to as a commercial lien that could in fact be used in regards to the Federal Reserve banks. Now, this technology has been around a long time, and we've used it successfully many, many times as we've tried to resolve, certain problems in commerce. And really, the source or the party that I learned this technique from was one Hartford Van Dyke. And he had done some wonderful things using that technique and that technology. And so when we started to contemplate, what could be done to resolve some of the issues with the Federal Reserve Bank, then this immediately came to mind. Now, one of the things that I learned by listening to Hartford was his statement, which was simply, nothing changes until the money moves. Nothing changes until the money moves. And so you can start talking about this, that, who did this to who, and who's wrong, who's right, blah, 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 blah. But nobody is going to change until money moves. And so how do you move money? Well, you take it from one place and you put it somewhere else. And so that's the purpose then of this process of using commercial liens. Now, for those who haven't had a chance to study on commercial liens and would like to do so, maybe I can plug myself to here just a little bit. If you go to my website, which is WSSIC.com, which stands for Winston Shrout Solutions in Commerce. If you go to that website, I did, in fact, do a single topic DVD that dealt specifically with the mechanics of commercial liens, the justification for doing so, along with templates and examples and so forth. Now, the purpose of doing a lien is to arrest the title to something. It's an arrest warrant. And so if you're wanting to make money move from one place to the next, then you would arrest the title to the money, which is a temporary taking. Now, if you want to actually physically move money or anything else, then you have to go into the levy state. Now, I think everybody listening to the program here in America knows this technique very well. The IRS has been using it for years and years and years and very successful at it, I might add. So anyway, in regards to the situation there, that Keith was elucidating this on about the 2.5 million metric tons of gold that was the responsibility of the Federal Reserve Bank. What Keith didn't bring to the front was that for the use of that gold, there was a simple payment of 4% per annum for the use of that gold. Now, when that was not paid, then that was, theft by deception. And that was, they agreed to do something, they were in breach of contract, and now the owners or the settlers or the responsible parties in regards to that gold had to take a remedy to rectify the problem. So, I just flat out asked Keith, I said, well, you go back and look at the original contract for the 4% and tell me, did they agree to pay that 4% in money or gold or whatever? So he looked at that contract and he said, no, it did not specify how the 4% was actually to be paid. Now, I said, okay. I said, then we can go to what is known as election of remedies. If there's not a specification of what the remedy shall be for a breach, then we can simply get them to agree by acquiescence to the remedy that we recommend. And so I recommended,
And welcome back to an exciting episode of End the Lie Radio. Winston, if you would, please continue.
Okay, I had gotten to the point of where I was about to discuss a concept known as election of remedies. And I had disclosed that we had gone back and looked at the original contract for the payment of the 4% per annum for the use of the gold. And we had discovered that it was not specified how that 4% should be paid. And so, again, using devices and technology that are part of the Admiralty procedures, and that technique, by the way, is a simple statement, which is failure to respond is fatal. And so we're using that technique then to get the agreement of the other party in regards to what manner that the 4% should have been paid and could be paid in the event they do so. And so we have specified that 4% should be paid in gold, just as the gold was put up for the original purpose. Now, what is the probability that the Federal Reserve Bank can produce that 4% in gold? At this point in history is very slim. At this point, that 4% has accumulated to be about twice the amount, actually more than twice the amount of the original amount of gold that was put up. Now, again, going back to our comparison with a sporting event, a football game or whatever, again, this is the first step of a strategy to cause and effect. And so we're not going to reveal what the strategy is next, but we're getting to that point. So that kind of was the basis and the reasoning, the strategy, the technology that was utilized to make the necessary corrections, within the Federal Reserve banking system to bring the thing back into sanity. All right, let's go on for a moment here. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time about this particular item because I want Keith to come back with some information of how we've applied this thought process and what the results have been in the international. And that is the mortgage foreclosure situation that's in the country. First off, this whole thing has been a conspiracy. And that was, the banks, the mortgage banks, did not reveal their strategy to the people. And in consequence of that, the people did not realize what was happening and basically jumped into a pit that they dug for themselves. And so there's been many efforts across the country for the last number of years to find various remedies and solutions to the mortgage foreclosure problems. And there's plenty of people across the country that have worked on this, have brought in viable solutions. But let me recommend that most, and not all of them, we do have some individuals who have administratively resolved mortgage situations. But by and large, a lot of these resolutions to the problems must occur in the court system itself, which is highly biased against the people, but we're starting to see a little bit of a break in that now. And so certainly one of the main thrusts, that myself and others have been doing is to teach court procedures, how to make things work in the court, how to properly present evidence, how to deal with the judges, how to deal with the attorneys, and all these kind of things. And actually, it's been pretty good fun in some instances. We really pushed the envelope, so to speak, in certain areas. And I don't need to go into all that. But again, we're seeing a huge swing in the pendulum as far as the thought process, from the top right down to the bottom. And we'll get this thing taken care of. We'll get it licked. And the main thing that we're involved in, the main thing we're concerned with is that people have places to live, shelter over their head for, there's no reason why people should be out on the street when we have, 10 or 12 homes in a neighborhood that nobody's living in. And we've even developed the technology to go in there and take over those homes as abandoned property. And we're doing it. And it's being done all across the country. So anyway, rather than spend a whole lot of time with that particular subject, since we have Keith with us, I would more than anything love for him to explain some of the things, some of the results that he has had working with some of the international financial ministers, and maybe he can tell the story about what happened in Ireland. Me being Irish, I love the story.
I'll just make a short comment before we go to the break. The issues in the international arena are exactly the same as they are when you go and enter into a mortgage. So when a country enters into a debt structure, it is exactly the same as if they were entering into a mortgage agreement on a home. There's really no difference. And what I'd like to do is explain basically what really happened with Ireland, because it's a fascinating situation, but it's one that's very, very clear once you understand what the actual background is. So we can go into that in a moment.
Continuing this discussion in the future, and just so people know, if they want to get in contact with these individuals, you can go to Winston Shrout's website, and that is WSSIC.com, WSSIC.com, and you can contact him through there. And if you'd like to get in touch with Keith, just let Winston know, and he can forward it on to Keith. And there is a ton of more information at WSSIC.com, and you can check that out to get some more information on the stuff that we weren't able to cover in these 2 hours. But if you would, please continue just in these final 10 minutes.
Okay. When you go to a bank for a loan, banks do not lend money. That's one of the biggest fallacies that in the financial system that exists, is that a bank actually lends money. Banks don't lend money. What a bank does is it extends your credit. And it does this against your birth certificate, which is registered within the Treasury, and there's a notional fund set or established against your birth certificate. Now, when you go to the bank and you borrow money, the bank simply ledgers the loan. Let's call it a loan so that everybody will understand it clearly. But in actual fact, it's not a loan. They ledger the extension of your credit. And that then is applied back against the Treasury, because that's where your credit is basically held against your birth certificate. So when they ledger that, they then give you the money. But the bank is not providing you that money. The bank has actually just created that money against your birth certificate. So what happens is the bank is not actually lending you a penny. So when a bank tells you it's lending you money, that's fundamentally a lie, because banks don't generally lend money. Now, when you apply that same principle to a country borrowing money, for example, Ireland had these massive debts into the hundreds of billions of pounds. What happened is that I happened to make an offhand comment to Neil Keenan one day, and I said, he was talking to me about it, and I said to him, well, look, that's all smoke and mirrors. It doesn't exist, that debt. And then he asked me to explain that. So I drafted a document which you can find in Financial Tyranny if you go to the interviews, and in the section where I was interviewed by David Wilcock, you will find this document in that section. And we sent that on to the finance minister in Ireland. And he came back with some questions to Neil. And Neil said to him, look, just simply ask them to show you where they lent you the money from. Tell them you'll pay your debts, but first ask them to show where they lent you this money from. And the answer to that is, of course, they can't, because they didn't lend it at all. They just simply put in a ledger that Ireland owes X amount of money to them. But they don't show where that money came from. And it's exactly the same with the bank. What the bank is doing when it tells you it lends you money is a lie. It's fraud. They don't lend you money. They simply ledger that money into your share into value. And in doing that, they do that against the Treasury. But then they don't pay back the Treasury. And it's exactly the same with the banks when they borrow, say they loan this money to a country. It is exactly the same process. So when the finance minister in Ireland understood this, he went back to them and he said, well, show me where you lent the money. And nobody could. That's why all of a sudden the whole thing about Irish debt just simply died.
I've heard people win mortgage cases, personal mortgage cases, using that same technique as well, saying, you know, show me the money that you actually lent me, show me the money actually existed, and you lent me actual money. And since that is absolutely impossible to do, thanks to fractional reserve banking, they actually won the case.
Absolutely, and that's a fact. The reality is the bank didn't lend any money. The bank lied all the way through. Now, the bank then demands from you. If you look at a mortgage, where is the value in the mortgage? The value is the house, the property. Now, that property should be registered into the Treasury so that the money created against it is issued against the property registered in the Treasury and the obligation registered in the Treasury and the payment registered to the Treasury. What the bank does is it registers the obligation against the Treasury and then says the income from this property belongs to us. It robs the Treasury. It's stealing the money that belongs to the Treasury. It's stealing the money that comes from the people. And it turns around and says, this money is ours. And what does it do? It bundles all these mortgages into securities and then sells them, almost as though that was their property. This is fraud. It's pure fraud the whole way through. And it needs to be stopped. And the only way I can see of stopping this is through this Keenan case, because the Keenan case brings forward the underlying problem. And when we can expose, and we will expose this inside the court system, how this whole system actually works. The banks are robbing the people. The banks are robbing the Treasury of the United States. Not only the Treasury of the United States, it's robbing the Treasury of every country in the world because they all operate under the same system. Once you brought in securitization, you ended banking. And I believe that if a bank cannot operate under its charter correctly and honestly, then its license should be taken from it. Its license to do conversion, which is convert your signature into value, that should be taken from the bank. And for God's sake, give it to a post office or someone. And let the post office have the power to do conversion and register it directly at the Treasury. Why do we need this? What is actually happening is criminal. And every banker who does it, he knows that this is not the way it should be. He sees what's actually happening. In some cases, there are bankers where it just doesn't register. A guy that's sitting in your local bank, he wouldn't have a clue. He just knows this is the procedure and this is what I have to do. But when you get it to the higher levels of banking, of course they know. Now, the worst part about it is that somewhere along the line there's going to be a day of reckoning. Do you think these people that have been cheated out of their homes should remain cheated, or should that issue be redressed? And I think it should be redressed. And I think the banks, where they've taken people out of their homes, should be either forced to give the home back, or alternatively, they should have to pay the person the value of the home plus every single penny that person has paid into paying off his home. That is what would be right and just under the law.
Keith, can you go ahead, though, and tell about the international implications, for instance, for the European community as it relates to other countries that might take up the same position as Ireland?
Okay. You've got Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy. I believe that they have no choice because these debts that they're supposed to have are all smoke and mirrors. I don't see that they have any reality or any obligation to pay them. And if they don't have a legal or moral obligation to pay a debt, why pay it? And if they fail to pay it, what happens then if somebody calls on the European Central Bank to settle all the bonds that have supposed to be settled by the European banks? The reality of it is that the European Union is a monstrosity that should not exist, and it's a monstrosity that needs to be got rid of. In the United States, things are different, and the reason for that is that underlying the United States we have the US dollar, and the US dollar is fully backed by this gold that's in the system. And the reason for that is that the US dollar is a global currency, not a US currency. It's not the currency of the United States. It's the currency of the world. And therefore, fully backed by the world assets.
I'm so sorry, Keith. We're coming up on the very end here. I'm hearing the final break music come in. But, this means that we will definitely have to pick up this conversation in the future. Maybe we can have you guys on again or do a podcast. We'll see what works out. But once again, visit WSSIC.com. That is Winston Trout's website. And you can go to endthelie.com for a lot more information. I am Madison Rupert, your host of End the Lie Radio. This has been an incredibly informative show. If you missed a moment, please go back and listen to it. And stay tuned because we are definitely going to revisit this topic. Other news outlets. Keith Scott was the chief of cabinet for the Office of International Treasury Control for 14 years and has an extensive understanding of the global accounts and the use of these accounts, which the general public knows nothing of. Keith has taught Neil Keenan much about these accounts, and this is why the case has taken the direction it has. And Keith and Winston will explain why the Keenan case is so explosive, and the judge assigned to the case retired, much to the astonishment of his staff, and a judge whose brother is an economic advisor to President Barack Obama has been appointed to try the case. And welcome.
Great to be here.
And good morning to everybody. It's good evening over in the U.S. I'm in Asia at the moment.
Well, thanks for coming on. It seems like we're having some static come through on Winston's connection. I'm not sure what that is. But Keith, Winston, if you would just give us an intro in these few minutes before we go to the first break. What is this case, and why is it so important?
Okay, this case, Madison, started off by just a common theft. $134 billion in bonds were stolen from Neil Keenan by a fellow by the name of Daniel Del Bosco. And Del Bosco may well have been induced to do this by David Sale, who is from the Office of International Treasury Control. Now, just to make things fairly clear here, I worked for Office of International Treasury Control for some 14 years. And I left there in 2008. At the time this occurred, I was back in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, which is where the Office of International Treasury Control actually is run from, by a man by the name of Dr. Ray C. Dam. Now, in this particular case, $134 billion were stolen. They were in the form of Federal Reserve notes or bonds. These bonds are genuine. The Federal Reserve may try to claim otherwise because when you look at the bonds themselves, they are written in such a way that they are deniable if you took them into a court. Now, the reason why this is, if somebody were to illegally possess these or try to use them, the government could then charge them with counterfeiting or fraud or whatever. And this avoids the government having to explain, not only the government, but the Federal Reserve having to explain exactly what these bonds are. Now, I will tell you this. There are the amount of these bonds that are in existence run into the many thousands of trillions of dollars. There is an enormous quantity out there. Now, let's try to keep with the actual case. So these bonds were stolen from Neil Keenan. Neil, when this first happened, nobody took a great deal of notice. He was kind of struggling. He then was introduced to myself. I explained to him that the bonds were genuine and that the actual owners of these bonds were the Dragon family, whom he represented, and that the Office of International Treasury Control, who claimed that they owned the bonds through David Sale, that they did not own the bonds. The bonds belonged to the Dragon family and therefore had been stolen from him. With that in case, I soon realised the value of this case, because what I could provide for Neil was the background, the history, and eventually I could even provide the codes that would allow us to prove in the banking screens that these bonds are genuine, that they are real. And that changed the complexion of the entire case. The reason why is because we would be able to prove that these bonds were genuine, that they were of value, and this would have exposed the entire system, the entire global system. But not only that, it would have exposed all the people who have been stealing and cheating and misusing these accounts for the last 50 years, because there is a record of that in the screens. And it probably would have meant something like about 300,000 bankers, politicians and other people would have been heading to jail. So that's the leverage that this case actually provides. If those screens are opened and there is a judicial review and a proper audit done on these accounts, that will then expose the entire corrupt system that we know as the Federal Reserve.
Wow, that's fascinating. And we're coming up on the first break here in a moment, but I just want to, when we come back, I'd like to list some of the things that we're going to go over in the next hour or so, hour and a half or so. And, you know, I also...
We're trying to correct the system and not destroy it. Now, this particular court case was filed into the United States District Court toward the end of last November, and the defendants very shortly thereafter came back with an offer to settle.
Today we have on Winston Shrout and Keith Scott. Now, this is relating back to a previous episode where we discussed the trillion-dollar lawsuit to end financial tyranny, as many people are referring to it, with Brandon Turbeville of ActivistPost.com. And this relates to a wide variety of things, but actually our guests today are kind of insiders on this story, so they have a lot more information to share on this front, and a lot of information which we will not be able to get anywhere else. And I'm very excited for this because they're going to be laying all this information out in a way that even someone like myself, who's not an economist or a financial guru by any means, and I'm sure many of our listeners are in a similar position where we can actually understand what's going on in this case and what it means, what the impact could be for all of us. But a little intro. Winston Shrout is an educator who specializes in commercial remedies and legal processes. He's been doing seminars all around the world, sharing his unique understanding of commerce and law. He is now an advisor to Neil Keenan on commercial matters. And like I mentioned, Neil Keenan is the individual who actually filed this lawsuit, which was actually detailed by Courthouse News and several. I want to connect this with one story that I covered, which I thought was fascinating, which was $6 trillion in allegedly fake bonds discovered in Italy in a Federal Reserve mother box. And Winston said, or Keith, I'm sorry, said that this does actually connect with what we're seeing here in this case. So you're listening to End the Lie Radio with Winston Shrout and Keith Scott. We will be coming back in a moment with much more information. Stick with. And welcome back to End the Lie Radio. I'm your host, Madison Rupert, on with my guest today, Keith Scott and Winston Shrout, discussing the Neil Keenan case, which is a $1 trillion lawsuit. That is a massive number, very, very, very hard to actually visualize that amount of money. But people have been calling this the lawsuit to end financial tyranny, and this has gotten a huge amount of attention in the alternative media. But today our guests are actually involved with this effort, and they're going to give us a lot of information which we will not be able to find anywhere else. I'm very grateful to have them on, and I'm going to try as much as possible to take a back seat today and let them just explain what this case is and what their work actually means and break this down for us. But before we delve into many of the details, or maybe we should actually give some more details before you can properly relate this incident. But if you could you tell us a little bit how this the $6 trillion in allegedly fake bonds found in the Treaty of Versailles Federal Reserve mother box in Italy plays into this?
Okay. The first thing to understand is that usually when these bonds are found, the first thing you need to understand is that